Day of the 1224 war, Azerbaijan continues a sharp escalation of relations with Moscow. In the country, the chief editor of the Azerbaijan satellite agency Igor Kartavykh and the chief editor Yevgeny Belousov are detained. They are accused of espionage. Sputnik proposed to blow up all over Azerbaijan. In general, the relationship with another neighbor of the Kremlin has gone one way. How far will both countries go in this confrontation? The question is open. The Soviet Union strikes were made on Donetsk, reported in particular about the air raids on the Yasinovataya railway junction, the metallurgical plant, and the headquarters of the Russian 8th General Army. Among the Ukrainian OSINTers, there is a discussion that this could not be the headquarters, but the place where they were engaged in BOPOLA and REBA. Russia tried to tell that the strikes were on a civilian object, but pretty quickly the flights were geolocated and it was established that these were objects used by the Russian army. Astro sources confirmed both successful attacks on Russian airfields. As a result, not even 4 but 5 Russian planes were hit by one of them. As a result, 3 RF helicopters were hit by the other. Already the 5th Russian tanker who entered the port was blown out by an explosion. What kind of strange disease is this for Russian ships? It is not yet clear. Before the incident on the ship Elmora, 4 oil tankers who had previously entered the Russian port were damaged by the explosion. After this series of explosions, the shipowners began to conduct an investigation of the underwater part of the ship's hull using divers and underwater drones. They are looking for mines or other explosive devices that can be installed on the hull from the outside, says Bloomberg. There is no data yet that this is the result of a diversion or Ukrainian, for example, attacks, but agree it looks quite impressive. The volunteers, in addition to the collapse of the assemblies, continue to experience the already familiar problem Russian commanders punish subordinates for receiving help from volunteers, so that at the top the non-ROCs do not think that their parts are unsupported by something. Although everyone knows that supplies from the Ministry of Defense in separate categories, such as RAP, will not be enough, we will be pleased once again with the policy of the Russian military department and the commanders who follow it. About this and much more in today's fresh video, which you can support with your like, your comments, and your subscription to the channel. All these actions help to promote it. Especially your subscription to YouTube algorithms is a super important indicator. You can support the channel financially on Patreon, the link to which is directly in the description. And by buying NVPN, this is a means of bypassing blockages, which I do so that you can bypass blockages, watch YouTube at normal speed, use Twitter, Instagram, Discord, blocked resources. In general, it is up to you to decide what to watch, listen, and read, and not to give it to the Russian state for purchase. NVPN is successfully coped with all the countermeasures of the country Roskomnadzor. By the way, it beats more and more, but we get out of it. So buy NVPN by the links in the description. Rubles, euros, dollars, cryptocurrency, everything is available to buy. And this is legal in Russia. It is not prohibited to buy. VPN is allowed to use, at least for now. In general, buy NVPN and support this channel, and we move on to what happened in the past 24 hours. Russian-Azerbaijani conflict caused by the arrest continues to gain momentum, and we assume the murder of the security forces of the Azerbaijanis in Yekaterinburg. I have already told you how the events with the participation of Russian actors were cancelled in Azerbaijan, and in the press began to compare Russia with Germany in the 1930s. Now, the Azerbaijani security forces detained the head editor of the state agency Sputnik of Azerbaijan, Igor Kartavykh, and the head editor, Yevgeny Belousov, reported by the Telegram channel Sputnik Azerbaijan. The Ministry of Internal Affairs of Azerbaijan confirmed the fact of detention. According to the statement of the ministry, the accreditation of the Sputnik of Azerbaijan was officially suspended in February 25. However, despite this, the newspaper continued its activity in the country. As stated in the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the work was carried out through illegal financing. During the search of Azerbaijan's satellite in Baku, 2 men were also arrested, whom the Azerbaijani media call supposed Russian intelligence officers. According to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the names of Kartavykh and Belousov are mentioned, who are allegedly FSB agents who work under the cover of journalists. The Russian side did not officially comment on the arrest of its citizens at the time of publication, although there were separate messages that they were not allowed to have any lawyers, that they could not contact them, and so on. Azerbaijan's satellite agency is part of the media holding Russia Today under the management of MIA Russia Today, a state-owned information agency under the control of the Kremlin. It seems to me remarkable how demonstratively the arrest took place. Under the cameras of various media, Azerbaijan openly challenges Russia. It's not just about the murders in Yekaterinburg, but about the accumulated claims, including systematic discrimination against ethnic Azerbaijanis in Russia. And of course, no one has forgotten about the defeat of the Azerbaijan Airlines plane and the Russian PVO over Grozny last year. I have no sympathy for the Azerbaijani authorities. Dictatorship there is no better than in Russia. Literally, on the days when activists of scientist backer Samdov were imprisoned there for 15 years. At this time, Baku gives an example of a struggle with the Russian influence to the so-called closest abroad and demonstrates the loss of levers of the Kremlin in the republics of the former USSR. This is a symptom of the loss of Russian status not only to the superpowers, but also to the regional hegemon. And all this happens because of the war with Ukraine. This is, in fact, a big, interesting topic. I'm still trying to get to it. I have some work to do that Russia, after the war with Ukraine, actually lost its geopolitical influence because, then you have the potential force. And no one knows how much it is really checked in practice. They are afraid of this more than when you showed your strength, and it turned out to be much lower than expected. Therefore, in fact, the war between Russia and Ukraine, where Russia has not achieved anything in 3.5 years, demonstrated to many states that Russia, in its current state, is not a very strong actor, at least not as strong as it seemed. Let's remember that Azerbaijan is now relying on the support of Turkey in international affairs, which, to put it mildly, takes a two-seat position in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and can easily change it even more pro-Ukrainian than now. But Azerbaijan shows that it happens when exactly what Russia is doing is applied against Russia. How many times did Russia announce journalists as agents of Western special services? Forbid concerts of unwanted performers, or even onion rings imported from Russia suddenly turned out to be infected. Remember, Russia did the same thing with Georgia, Russia did the same thing with Armenia. This is how some kind of political conflict in Russia is going on. Daddies, so you have this one, your products are clearly not the same. Do you remember when Borjomi was forbidden in Russia? Russia pays attention to the reaction of the military community, which calls for various actions. So Slavyovsky Martin says that Baku is a Russian city and is parallel to Ukraine. It is important here that I have repeatedly emphasized that Russia is a threat to all neighboring countries. Therefore, the issue is not to remove the desire of the Kremlin to capture and make marionettes of all neighbors, but to take away such an opportunity from the Russian Federation. Journalists have revealed another scheme of supply of goods sanctions in Russia to the issue of opportunities, this time for the production of rockets. Headed by the Russians, the Czech trade and export company Leseft International supplies from the countries of the European Union complex, in some cases, sanctioned products in the field of metallurgy and machining to the Russian Auruz Polymet, the key supplier for the Russian rocket-building company. Trap aggressor analysts report on this in an article for Economic Truth. The company located in Ostrava is in fact an intermediary that helps Russia to pass international sanctions, supply defective products for the defense industry sector. Its general director, Cyprian Lev Avinsovich, was or still is a citizen of Russia. According to customs data, since the beginning of the full-scale war, the company ordered products for the Russian Federation, or rather for the Russian Parliament, for a total of more than $22 million. Part of the goods were delivered by order of Leseft in violation of the export restrictions of the European Union. Through a Czech intermediary, Rospolimet also receives products from companies from the EU and China. For example, NC GmbH, a Swiss metallurgical engineering company which produces industrial equipment for energy, chemical, and metallurgical industries. Through Leseft also exports products to REF, a German metallurgical company, SMS Group GmbH, which still has an enterprise in Russia, despite a claim to exit the market. In response to a request from Trap Aggressor, the company reported that the last supply was before the beginning of the full-scale war, and the activity of the Russian structure was reduced but not closed. AORUS Polymed is one of the most modern Russian metallurgical enterprises of the full cycle, from shipping to the release of the final product. The enterprise's products are used in machine building, aircraft construction, nuclear power, and other industries. The company delivers blanks and ready-made products, including constructions of fat-resistant fuses, which are critical for the production of turbojet engines, both blades and parts of the hull. AO consists of several companies, the total income of which only in 2022 was more than 13 billion rubles. Among the largest customers are Russian PKA companies, which produce weapons. In the structure of LSF International in 2013, a subsidiary company Chronotech Impact was created, which is the director of which are the Ukrainians Oleg Oksana Yurovy. In Ukraine, they head the company Arada Invest, which produces metallurgical products, including packaging of forged products from which complex metal constructions are milled. In response to the request from Trap Aggressor, Oleg Yurovy himself did not refuse to cooperate with the Czech company, and emphasized that his Ukrainian company does not have information about the economic relations between LSF and AORUS Parliament. I would like to thank the journalists of the investigators who actually perform the work for the organs of the sanctioned supervision, who, it is not clear what the European taxpayers spend their money on if they pass such an unforgivable delivery scheme without their attention. Until the EU takes seriously to comply with its own sanctions, only Ukrainian drones will cause serious damage to the Russian VPC from the outside. In the evening of June 30, Telegram channels reported about a large-scale Ukrainian missile strike on Donetsk and published the corresponding video. In particular, they reported about flights over the railway junction in Yasinovataya, a metallurgical plant and the headquarters of the Russian 8th General Army. Analysts of the project, Cyberborashno, however, deny the blow to the headquarters, indicating that it actually flew over the object where they worked on the BPA and RAP. In turn, the Dnipro-Garbuz channel geolocalizes one of the flights on the territory of the Donetsk State Institute of Color Metals. It's difficult to say what was located there, but it is necessary to remember that the Russian forces in Donbass have been using the enterprises that have stopped in the Russian world for various purposes since 2014, from the deployment of personal equipment, personnel, and ammunition to the detention of torture of Ukrainian military and civilian residents. Meanwhile, the sources of Astra confirmed the attack on the Marinov airfield on June 27. As a result, 5 Su-34 aircraft were damaged, 3 of which burned completely and 2 more partially. I will note that the SSU and the SBU talked about 4 damaged aircraft with a separate commentator, who allegedly claimed from insider positions that Ukrainians are increasing the scale of the damage. As you can see, on the contrary, they are decreasing. In addition, 1 serviceman was injured. Also, according to sources, UAVs that night tried to hit the gas distribution station Gazprom Transgaz. In addition, another successful joint attack of the SBU and the SSU was confirmed. Ukraine destroyed 1 and damaged 2 helicopters at the military airfield in Crimea. The wreckage of UAVs fell on the territory of the Kirovskoye airfield in the east of Crimea on June 28. Astro also reported on this. As a result, the Mi-8 helicopter was destroyed. Also, 2 helicopters, Mi-24 and Mi-26, were damaged. There are no wounds. Earlier, the SBU reported on a strike on the airfield, saying that as a result of the attack, 3 helicopters and an anti-aircraft missile system, Panzer-S1, were destroyed. This is why the messages of the SBU General Staff deserve much more trust than the endless lie of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. They are confirmed in the future and with accuracy to each affected object. Sometimes the Ukrainian side even lowers it, as in the case of the Su-34. Well, in order for the Ukrainian military to continue to repel Russian attacks, hold the front, protect their relatives and loved ones, and simply prevent Russian military aggression, we continue to help them with the assemblies and continue to assemble. A mobile complex RZO based on a powerful pickup. This is all for the destruction of the occupant. This is not, some kind of medical division. No, this is a means of killing fascists and occupants. And I remind you of the guy's address where they show in particular how this means works. We want to call again for help in the purchase of a mobile complex RZO based on a powerful pickup. This technique will make our intelligence more effective and Here is the QR code for Monobank in the description of Monobank, Private, PayPal, Bitcoin, USDT C20 and Ethereum. All this is available to you. Let's help the Ukrainian defenders together. And thank you to everyone who has already contributed. I have already participated in this collection. I will definitely participate again. I hope you will also participate. Well, we continue. The explosion destroyed the 5th tanker that entered the Russian ports. The tanker Vilamora, which carried about 1 million barrels of oil, had an explosion near the coast of Libya, reported on Monday to the company that controls the vessel. Not long before that, the vessel entered the Russian port of Ust-Luga, Bloomberg wrote. This is the 5th explosion on tankers that entered the Russian ports since the beginning of the year, reported the consulting company in the field of sea risks Vanguard Tech. The explosion on the tanker Vilamora led to water hitting the engine compartment, which is currently flooded, reported in the Greek company TMS Tankers. According to the company representative, as a result of the explosion, the pollution of the environment did not occur and the entire crew is safe. The reason for the incident is still unknown, it is said in the publication. Now the ship is towed to Greece, where the damage to the explosion will be installed, writes Bloomberg. Alamora, twice since April, entered the Russian oil terminal where it loaded the oil of the Kazakh origin. This is evidenced by the data from the surveillance of the ships in the analyzed Bloomberg. At the beginning of April, the ship entered the port of Ust-Luga, and in May it entered the terminal of the Caspian Pipeline Consortium near Novorossiysk. It is said in the publication, both objects are used to unload mostly Kazakhstan oil. Before the incident on the ship Velimora, 4 oil tankers who had previously entered the Russian ports were hit by the explosion. After this series of explosions, the shipowner began to conduct an investigation of the underwater part of the ship's hull using divers and underwater drones. They are looking for mines or other explosive devices that can be installed on the hull from the outside, Bloomberg writes. The Velimora tanker seems to have no sanction lists, however. I hope that after this incident, the insurers will learn that the tanker's entry into the Russian ports is in general dangerous for the structural integrity of the ships, and this should be avoided. Well, given that even the sanctioned Russian tankers continue to walk on the sea, in general, their physical destruction is, in my opinion, the only option. I don't know if it was, maybe it's a coincidence because Russia has bought such hulls that breathe properly, and there can explode anything whenever you want and so on. But if this is, to put it mildly, a part of the war, then I only approve it. And as you remember, I called for this for a long time. All Russian courts providing a Russian economic machine should be destroyed. And thank you. If this is really the case, what is the way in which the crew does not harm anything, as the environment does not harm anything? This is a great approach, and if this is really the result of the sabotage from the SBU or BURA, then I can only support this. The economy of the aggressor's country, which is trying to destroy you, must be wiped out. Since the spring of last year, the SBU has arrested more than 700 people for spying on the joke or playing the explosion in Ukraine, of which 175 or about 25% were younger than 18 years. This was reported by the Financial Times by the former Artem Datarenko. Most of the detainees did their job consciously, although there were such cases when people were simply deceived and did not understand what they were doing. The large-scale campaign to recruit Ukrainians for sabotage began last spring, said Datarenko. At first, Russian curators suggested burning cars and transformer substations on the railway. Then came the task of burning and waiting for territorial centers to complete the Ukrainian analog of Russian military commandos. And this year, they switched to the use of Ukrainians as terrorists of the mortals, said Dekhterenko. As the newspaper recalls, in March, 2 teenagers of 15-17 years were recruited to carry out an explosion at Ivano-Frankivsk railway station. However, the explosive device hidden in a bag in one of them exploded ahead of time. Supposedly, it was carried out remotely. One teenager died, the other was injured. Russian curators, in fact, turned them into unwilling terrorists of the mortals, writes Financial Times. Russian special services recruit those who remain unwilling or are forced to leave the house due to combat actions, experience financial difficulties, or simply want to buy a new iPhone, notes Financial Times. The recruitment is carried out through Telegram, Discord, WhatsApp, or Viber. In order to interest teenagers, Russian special services come up with, including pseudo-quests. In December 2024, 2 friends, 15 and 16 years old, were arrested in Kharkov, who were monitoring the PVO positions and coordinated the targets of airstrikes and set fires, believing that they were playing a game. The teenagers sent collected intelligence data the SFSB curator via Telegram. According to the SBU, the Russian military used this intelligence data to report airstrikes in Kharkov. Ukrainian authorities started a nationwide campaign, an information campaign aimed at recruiting. During it, about attempts to recruit through messengers. Reported about 50 teenagers, writes Financial Times. The FSB also accuses Ukrainian special services of recruiting Russians, including teenagers, for sabotage. According to information from February 22 to November 24, no less than 131 people were arrested in the country for the arson related to the war in Ukraine. 50 of them are underage. The Russian authorities are also conducting an information campaign. In the videos, they warn about the long term for arson. You have an element of spy wars of a new type. A mass hunt for potential saboteurs and spies in social networks has taken place at a quiet meeting with agents in unspecified cafes in the capital of the enemy. The special services have never had such a wide access to the enemy's population, which they are happy to use not only in the Russian-Ukrainian war. As Telegraph recently wrote, both Mossad and Iranian special services are operating in the enemy's social networks. The scale of Mossad's success was demonstrated during the 12-day war, when it turned out that the Israeli intelligence was in the course where the visible Iranian generals and physicists were sleeping. On this background, past the general attention, the June news passed that the Israeli police and counterintelligence of Shin Bet arrested 3 Israelis for suspicion of espionage in favor of Iran. The former head of the Mossad counter-terrorist unit, Adad Alam, told The Telegraph that Iran is particularly active in dealing with new reporters who are in a difficult economic situation and who do not feel special loyalty to the state of Israel. The promotion through social networks has firmly established itself in the arsenal of all special services in the world, and with this threat, it will have to be considered a counterintelligence body around the world. Internal analysis of the management of the Supreme Commissar of the UN on Human Rights admitted that the explosion of the colony number 120 in Yelena in the Donetsk region, as a result of which more than 50 Ukrainian prisoners were killed on the night of July 29, 22, was a planned attack from Russia. This was reported by the Ukrainian ambassador Dmitry Lubinets, referring to the data from the report of the Center for Human Rights in the Armed Conflict. Apparently, the center has nothing to do with the UN. Lubinets calls the authors of the report the UN expert group. According to the report, no HIMARS missiles, as the Russian state claimed, were used in Yasinovataya. Explosions took place inside the barracks and were caused by artillery shells fired from the southeast direction, that is, from the territory controlled by Russia. The report states that Russian 120 MZOF-74 thermobaric shells with high temperature and powerful shock wave were used. Shock was delivered from self-propelled artillery systems equipped with weapons such as 2A-51, 60-80-81, for example, NONOS, NONOSVK, Vina Hosta with a distance of 2.8 km. It was these characteristics that allowed us to create a false impression about the possible use of Western weapons to blame Ukraine for the attack. It is also noted in the document that the attack was carried by the character of the staging operation, probably agreed to at the highest level with the participation of the General Staff of the Investigative Committee of the VSIN and representatives of the so-called DPR. Participation of the mercenaries of CHVK Wagner as organizers is excluded. In total, at the preparation and storage of traces of the attack, at least 20 people could participate, including the commandment of the 61st and 155th Brigades of the Navy and the 11th Guard Self-Defense Regiment. For the attack, according to the version of the experts, the VSIN employees were brought to the barracks number 200, where there was an explosion. Supposedly, the purpose of the attack was to interfere with the supply of Western weapons to Ukraine and influence the agenda of the UN Security Council, the meeting of which was scheduled for the next day. Of course, the report contains extremely interesting information. The fact that it was popularized only 3 years later, and even in the bypass of the official structure of the UN, is a punishment for the international organization. These conclusions make sense in the heat of the moment, until the international community has weakened its political will, one way or another. Punish the faces of those who committed crimes and the state as a killer. Now, during the time that passed since the coup in Olenivka, the Russian military machine committed many no less terrible crimes, and it is unlikely to expect additional sanctions or at least serious attention of the world media. In the consciousness of many readers, the viewer is fixed, well, something is not clear with Olenivka, despite the fact that Olenivka, we, for example, disassembled it with Ruslan Leviev. Well, in my opinion, a week after it happened, it was already confirmed that there could not have been HIMARS. We even talked about this. Translation and so on, but now because of the low speed of action, many people are probably like, well, the hell does he know what happened in Yasinovataya? We know what happened in Yasinovataya. Russia drove Ukrainian prisoners of war into one barrack and banged on them and burned these people in order to set up the Ukrainian side. They did not succeed, they did not achieve the desired results, but they killed people by actually carrying out a false flag operation. And now no one will remember about it, no one will recognize it, because this is a topic that has been around for a long time. In fact, you can learn about the continuing Russian crimes from the same UN, under the supervision of the Supreme Commissioner of the UN on Human Rights. From December 1, 1924 to May 31, 1925, 968 civilians were killed in the war, 4,807 were injured. This is 37% more than in the same period a year earlier. Most of the civilians died in the territories controlled by Ukraine as a result of Russian attacks. The report also talks about the violation of the rule of law on prisoners of war. The government recorded 35 cases in half a year when Russian military executed Ukrainian prisoners and one case of execution of a Russian-Ukrainian soldier. It also talks about the violation of international law in the territories occupied by Russia, pressure on local residents so that they receive a Russian passport, a staff for demonstration of Ukrainian identity, expropriation of private property, and uncontrolled Ukraine. An investigation of the Ukrainians for work on charges of collaboration. It is impossible for men to refuse the service for the sake of conscience and difficulties with the evacuation of the elderly and people with limited opportunities. And here, it seems to me, there is another problem of international organizations. They put a false sign of equality between the aggressor and the victim, between the dictatorship, which is actively and systematically unfolding its repressive apparatus, and democracy in the captured territories, which are forced to limit the rights and freedoms of citizens so that they do not fall under the same cataclysm of repression as their fellow citizens in occupation. The Ukrainian authorities can be accused of the same success in the attacks on freedom of information, for the ban on filming the flights and the work of the PVO. But think about it, these accusations, on the one hand, they say that in Russia and in the occupied Russian territories, they are being repressed for the manifestation of Ukrainian identity. And in Ukraine, they say that they have suspicions about the collaboration with Russia. And before that, we learned that the Russian FSB spends a huge amount of money to recruit people. We know a lot of stories, unfortunately, when Ukrainian citizens recruited by the Russian side coordinated flights, including, remember, the funeral process when 50 civilians died. This is madness. This is nonsense. Or that you can't refuse service in the army. Well, yes, during the war, mobilization was attacked in the war to protect the country, protect relatives and loved ones from being killed. Yes, it happens when you are attacked. It was the same in the Soviet Union during the Great Patriotic War. It was the same everywhere. When you are destroyed, yes, the country conducts mobilization. Mobilization is always an obligatory story. One thing is that when you mobilize people for an aggressive, seductive war, yes, of course, there is a composition of international crimes and a lot of other things that can be foreseen. But when you mobilize people for a defensive war to protect against the aggressor, what questions can there be here? And what else? The UN wants to fight instead of Ukraine. Well, let it go and fight then. And if it doesn't want to, then let it, excuse me, beep off. You are not investigating Yasinovataya. You are engaged in other crimes that they simply ignore, always sucking up the Russian side, sucking up not even directly, but simply helping them, useful idiots. Therefore, all these international organizations, Red Cross, UN, Amnesty International, this is a piece of beep, which does not work and only helps the aggressor, because for the sake of some kind of abstract, I don't know. They equate absolutely unequal things, and where they really need their participation, where they really need their intervention, investigation, and everything else. They sit and look in the corner at what is happening. It seems to me that this is a terrible situation that shows that all these institutions are simply already dead, although they pretend to be breathing. But we move on to the front line. Deep State once again notes the progress of the Russians in a number of settlements in the South Donetsk region. At this time, in the region of Zeleny, Kuta, Zerka, Yalta, Volny, Poly, Shevchenko, and Fedorovka. In the project in which more details are stopped on the situation in the direction that became at least one of the most difficult for the defense forces. Deep State does not confirm the capture of the Dachnoi, allegedly the first settlement in Dnipropetrovsk region, which, according to Zetniks, was occupied by Russian armed forces, but announces the rapid loss of a number of settlements in the south of Donetsk. The Russians continue to actively push along the line of settlements from Novopol and Novozerjevka. This is a plot where there have been many changes on the map in recent times, and the largest areas of the gray zone have been applied in one place. In particular, the area of Alexivka, Bogota, or Zelny Kuta is now clarified, where there was a promotion in the last update. Most likely, these settlements will soon move to the red zone. Plot of Yalta Zvezda-Podobnaya turned out to be unexpected for us, where Russian armed forces found an opportunity to advance around the settlements and the positions of the Ukrainian defense forces and were fixed in Podobnaya. Therefore, the gray zone in the direction of this village has increased. However, the Russian movement there is not fixed yet. Our fighters destroy them in the process of movement. There are also active assault actions in the Shevchenko area, which the Russian forces have almost completely occupied, and in the free field, where the presence of the Russians is very often recorded. In the near future, we can expect frequent updates on these areas. Separately, at the settlement of Dachna in the Dnipropetrovsk region, where the gray zone appeared, which became a reason for shouting and speculative headlines in some Telegram channels, as well as attracted the attention of the Ukrainian media. It is no secret to anyone that Russian armed forces strives to enter the territory of the Dnipropetrovsk region and uses such movements primarily for media purposes. And the Ukrainian information space is very actively helping the Russians in this. As for the gray zone, the presence of the Russians in this area is recorded. They constantly try to break through there to secure themselves, at least in the forest, but the fighters of the defense force make an effort to immediately destroy the Moscow plague and prevent it from being fixed or accumulated. These once-in-a-lifetime incitements do not carry either tactical or strategic benefits, but are alarming call in terms of worsening the situation. We have seen a similar situation in the area of Orkhavaya, where there were many talks about the invasion of the OSR in the Dnipropetrovsk region, but the Ukrainian fighters managed to contain the pressure, and now no one is shouting about serious developments in that area. Suddenly, he ceased to be of interest to the majority. The best media ajar about these events should be the attraction of society to the volunteer and the help of our fighters. After all, the Russian horde can only be stopped by its destruction. We closely monitor the situation at the front, try to be objective and conspicuous, treat the information in place, and be sure to make changes to the map when they appear, wherever they happen, says Deep State. Ukrainian military author of the Telegram channel Officer also responds to the situation at the site, quite gloomy. The character of the movement of Russian armed forces towards the Dnipropetrovsk sky has changed, he says. If in the spring it still looked like thin quarters, then now the Russians are pressing on the entire line of combat. Just a month ago, our units were still under Constantinople, and now we are losing the camera. I would pay more attention not to the fact that they will cross the administrative border, but to how much we have left under the control of the territory of Donetsk. The officer points out in this section, Let's move on to the Lemon direction. The Ukrainian military officer Stanislav Bunyatov tells about the ongoing Russian attacks on the Lemon direction in the area of Torskoy, which the defense forces have so far managed to cross. On the Torskoy direction, he writes that the Russians are regularly trying to storm our positions in order, and on motorcycles, Bunyatov writes, in particular, today there was another unsuccessful motorway of 10 units, the goal of which was to check the capabilities of our crew. On the site, he clarifies how exactly the offensive actions of Russian armed forces take place in this area can be seen in the video of the destruction of the Russian storm group, which is trying to attack through the clean field by drone operators of the Ukrainian 63rd Brigade Unmanned Systems Battalion. The Project War FG allocates the place of events just in the area of Torskoy to the east of the settlement point, the Zaporizhzhia Oblast. We are moving there. In the Zaporizhzhia Oblast, Deep State records the progress of the Russian troops in Malinovka at the junction with the South Donetsk Oblast. Stanislav Bunyatov, in turn, reports on the tactical successes of the Russians in the area of Kamensky Orkhov and characterizes the situation in the direction in general, and it is quite restrained. Here's what he writes. In the Zaporizhzhia Oblast, Russian armed forces was really active and pulled up the reserves. The main activity is observed in the Kamensky Orkhov area. They have significant statistical progress without the threat of a large-scale breakthrough. In other places, our guys copy their breakthroughs in time. In general, this was expected. The main thing is to activate those areas where there was no movement for a long time. Because, in the opinion of the enemy, there is a sudden effect. I don't draw pink pictures, but if there is something to shout about, I will shout, promises Bunyatov. Apparently, so far the Russians have not been able to create another crisis in this area, but it still requires close attention. Channel Lokagora provides an infographic on the use of Russian shacks and BPA imitators in June, according to the Air Force of the Soviet Union. According to this information, in the last month, Russian armed forces used the record 5,419 long-range drones, half of which were shot down, another 36 were false targets or were planted by RAP, and another 14 or 734 drones achieved their goals. This is a lot. In the absolute statement, the number of flights was also recorded, which is an alarming call because according to all forecasts, the number of drones used by the Russians will only increase. There is a certain hope for improving the situation. The Minister of Digital Transformation of Ukraine, Mikhail Fedorov, talks about a breakthrough in the development of interceptor drones and promises to assess the results of this technology during the summer. As for Russian equipment in general, the channel Akagora provides an infographic about the loss of Russian tanks, armored vehicles, unarmored vehicles, and Twitter user Monsteds, which is based on the general staff data. The losses in the general staff data may be increased as they significantly exceed the visually confirmed data. However, they can still be traced by the dynamics, which indicates the actual disappearance of Russian combat vehicles from the battlefield. Also, if in 2024 the relative losses of tanks reached 20%, armored vehicles reached 30%, and only half of the losses on the battlefield occurred on light civilian vehicles, that is, now the losses of unarmored vehicles, buggy motorcycles, and the like exceed 90%. Less than 1/10 of the losses are due to a full-fledged combat vehicle. According to the ASINTRA data, which I provided earlier, it came to the fact that Russian armed forces loses less equipment than it is being supplied. That is, it is possible to accumulate it for a new mechanized offensive or an invasion into NATO countries. In the first place, the mass use of armored vehicles is unlikely to allow to break the situation on the front line. As the experience of 2024 showed, then Europeans, primarily in the Baltic countries, should seriously prepare and, first of all, take the Ukrainian experience of the production of drones and the defeats of enemy vehicles. Russian military officer Svyatoslav Golikov comments on the material of the Ukrainian analyst Tatarij Gami, where he described the Russian tactic of motorcycle assaults. According to Golikov, in the form in which this tactic is used in Russian armed forces, it is harmful and ineffective, and without systemic changes, the approach to attacking actions will not give results. With all the advantages, he writes, which gives motor transport to the assault group, this is, of course, very vulnerable, Golikov writes. In particular, FPV drones will in any case keep the speed and maneuverability of the enemy artillery, because the Western ART system practically does not give artillery screws, and from which you can come out, the targets are covered from the first or second shot. Plus, the cassette ammunition provides effective destruction even of the cut-off groups. Motorized dragoons are not protected from fire, shooting, armament, and so on. The calculation is done at the speed of overcoming the gray zone and disengaging enemy air reconnaissance with high mobile targets. At the same time, assault motor groups carry high losses, and in case of success the breakthroughs are often in tactical bags. But this circumstance, I believe, says that it is not at all about that motor transport is not a place on the battlefield and especially in the close rear. High losses of the personal composition and the material part directly flow from the conceptual damage of approaches to small motorization in its current performance. Loss of sacred knowledge and skills on the part of the relevant organization of the enemy has led, in its time, to the practice of numerous attacks by small infantry groups, and most often poorly prepared with the aim of gradually eradicating the enemy. I have already said 100 and 500 times about the damage of this practice, which is poured into the heavy loss of our own forces and resources. At the same time, the enemy also marks a direct negative impact, which still preserves the problem with the organization of coordination, interaction, and effectiveness of the use of assault groups. The proposed transfer of the purchase of equipment on a mass and centralized basis is a logical decision, but in the absence of high-quality transformation systems, excessive losses of infantry are simply supplemented and will be supplemented by excessive losses of this very equipment. And on single-use assault vehicles with single-use motorcycles you will not go far, complains Golikov. Based on the cost of the same motorcycles, it would be more logical to send a large part of the funds to us for the mass purchase of small reconnaissance APCs, shock drones of a tactical level, and modern means of communication, based on which you can build shock and combat control systems, designed to ensure successful combat tasks with minimization of loss of personal component and material part. Loss of the concept of dragonization in the form in which it is now implemented I see in the fact that, by and large, there's a simple replacement of the assault group on a bicycle, without the correction of the general paradigm of offensive actions, high-quality movement of the organization, providing the appropriate technical equipment directly to the assault group, and what is also extremely important, high-quality changes in the Gallic Desert. Because the Russian command is often deaf to such announcements, it is important to find a magic button for it, which should solve the problems of Russian armed forces on the front in one stroke. Now, in the role of such a button, there are motorized assaults, then they come up with some kind of half-solution. Just not to carry out labor-intensive system changes, for which there are often simply no performers, taking into account the quality of the Russian officer corps and the regular composition, which the Gallic himself had repeatedly complained about. But let's hope this will remain the case. The volunteers, in addition to the collapse of the collection, continue to experience the already familiar problem. Russian commanders punish subordinates for receiving help from volunteers, so that at the top they do not necessarily think that their parts are not provided with something. Although everyone knows that supply from the Ministry of Defense in separate categories such as RAP will not wait in principle. This time, the runaway Latvian military blogger Kirill Fyodorov wrote the following: "Now there will be just thoughts in the ear and the question of the hall," he writes. That having seen that we have gathered half a lot of help and sent it to the front line, F***CK these subordinates. Moreover, the video collection was in a deaf forest, without faces, without directions, without data which can help Ukrainians at least somehow. That is, in the dry remains. The commander did not provide equipment. The commander is against providing equipment to the people of Russia. The commander is outraged by the third increase in the combat capabilities of his subordinates. There is one question, writes Fedorov, and who does this commander work for and who did he give the oath to? And does he need a victory postscript? The post is removed from the collection, but the guy will get help. I have a postscript and I also have high-ranking commanders who understand the importance of it. He will get help and they will sort it out within the military tradition of the laws. I would not be so sure in the Russian system at the place of Fedorov. There is little chance of punishment for insufficient supply, because then there were questions to the very high-ranking commanders. And how did they allow their subordinates to live on the supply of high-ranking commanders? So Fedorov will have to go without a video transmission of help, without a new wave of donations to the next luxury car for Fedorov himself. Yes, because whether we can be sure in her words, no, perhaps it will go to a new car for him. Russian military men went for the awards and ended up in the basement. Russian military men were lured to reward in Kursk, but instead of Kursk, they were in handcuffs and ended up in an illegal basement for the prisoners of Zaitsev, the self-proclaimed LPR. Their relatives demanded their release. On June 22, the soldiers of the 720-162 military unit, Sergeant Sergei Zazulenko and the junior lieutenant Zainalin, were sent to the commander supposedly in the course of reward and told about their sharp husbands. However, instead, the sergeants and the junior lieutenant ended up in an illegal basement for those who refused to fight, and the soldiers of Zaitsev and Lugansk Oblast, Ukraine, the women say. They were allegedly invited to the course of reward on Sunday. After that, they did not go on the phone. The phones were turned off. They disappeared. On Wednesday, they got in touch, said that they were in handcuffs, they were held in a pit and then brought to Zaitsevo. Since then, there was no contact with them, said Astra's wife and sergeant. Also in the line, Astra contacted the wife of the junior lieutenant Zainalina. He claims that she was to evict her wife from the front line and detain her. The commanders deliberately made a fake, as the woman believes, signature on the need to arrive at the reward in the course. I established that the signature of the lieutenant colonel and the captain in the document do not coincide with the signatures in other documents. That is, the signatures are fake, and so it happened. Kamil and Sergei are tied up, they are not fed, they barely asked to call. The husband managed to say that the hands and feet were tied to them when transporting, and that in addition to them, Zaitsevo was taken away by many more soldiers, said Astriala. She believes that the reason for the arrest of her husband was that he was against the lawlessness of the unit. Women wrote an appeal to the military prosecutor's office and other departments and demand that their relatives be released from prison. I also recommend that you write Sport Lotto. Sportlotto is, let me remind you, an illegal place for detainees and military officers. There, Russian soldiers are persuaded to return to the front, keep in inhuman conditions, sometimes tortured. Journalists publish exclusive videos from this camp. The entire Astra has already found 23 places. News of the Russians' struggle with deserting. Tatiana, the mother of a military man, Artem Martynenko, born in 1991, who serves in the 35th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade, the military unit 41659, applied for help. According to her, the military police applied force to her son and took him to the plane in an unconscious state to send him to the SSO. On April 30, 1924, Artem signed a contract for K3 in Barnaul. After some time, he was injured and was treated at the hospital in Novosibirsk. While he was being treated, the command announced him to the remaining unit, after which, according to the woman, they stopped paying him for the money. Subsequently, the soldier refused to return to the unit. While he was in the hospital, he was declared in Sochi and they stopped paying him for the money. After that, he refused to return to the unit. From August 24 to June 25, he was cleaned in Sochi. On June 19, the soldiers were detained. Police officers were transferred to the police station. A week later, on June 27, his mother was stabbed with unknown drugs. Handcuffs were put on him. His legs were wrapped with tape, and in an unconscious state, he was loaded into a car. Later, he was taken to Novosibirsk to be sent to the rescue zone. As it is claimed, the handcuffs were removed only in the plane. On June 27, 2025, handcuffs were put on him. He was stabbed with unknown drugs so that he could not resist. When he was unconscious, he was wrapped up with straps and scotch tape. He was carried into a civilian car and taken to the city of Novosibirsk to be sent to the SVO zone. Tatiana said that the commander Artem, aka Pavel Pedikov, told her that a criminal case had been filed against Artem under Article 337 of the Criminal Review of the Self-Defense Forces. Channel Don't Wait for Good News mentions that information about the lawlessness in this military unit was previously published, in particular, the appeal of the soldier returned from captivity. The command did not provide him with a rehabilitation or a vacation, and now he is trying to send him back to the SVO. Also, one of the officers of this unit told about regular consumption of alcohol by commanders and physical violence against personnel. In addition, she reported about the case of resetting of soldiers. Another confirmation that the Russian authorities do not need not only the so-called heroes of the SVO, but also their relatives. The mother of the deceased participant of the SVO lives in terrible conditions. The local authorities ignore her address and do not provide any help. Svetlana Lemekina, a resident of the city of Sardavala and the mother of the deceased participant of the SVO, Lemekina Andriy Sergeyevich, showed terrible conditions in which she lives and told about the indifference of the country and the state. Since 1922, Andriy took part in the combat actions of the 76th Guards Assault Division. During the service, he was 3 times wounded. The last wound turned out to be fatal. After his death, the woman was left alone with no support and help. Despite numerous appeals, the local authorities continue to ignore her requests. Svetlana lives in terrible conditions in an emergency house without heating and elementary household amenities. It was in this apartment that Andriy lived before sending to the front. On June 25, the woman appealed to the deputy of the United Russia Party. The deputy sent an appeal to the first deputy to the head of the Republic, Karelia Sergeyev. According to her, this was not the first appeal to the authorities. Circumstances were recorded, a search was carried out, the necessary data was collected. However, even after that, there were no real actions from the side of the administration. The woman was simply sent to another station. I don't know now how and where to turn to get something done in this apartment. According to the woman, the local authorities avoid giving answers, do not provide support, do not take any steps to provide decent living conditions, despite the fact that her son died on the SVO. The soldier who ran away from the war killed a friend in the Smolensk region. As Astra found out on June 24 in the city of Velik in the Smolensk region, the body of a killed resident of Kaluga was found. It turned out that the murder was committed by a knife by a 30-year-old soldier in the military unit 44740 for Dmitry Kovalenko. As Astra found out, Kovalenko was previously convicted of robbery, took part in the invasion of the Russian Federation of Ukraine. However, at some point he fled from the war and was in search. The soldier was detained. It should be noted that if a year ago the majority of veterans who committed crimes in the rear were in the Wagner or Mino Baron language, who served a 6-month contract, then now, when all the wars are in a long-term cabal, criminal chronicles now feature juicers and deserters. This problem will inevitably increase as the army's ranks rise with its meat assaults and zeros. That's all for today. Michael Nacke was with you. See you soon. All the best. Bye.